I want to talk about rest today. And first thing I want to mention is I think all of us have an idea of how with a really good story, a really good experience, that there is that point of resolution where you kind of take an exhale and everything came together, where the story completes. Netflix is very well aware of this. All the shows that we have are very well aware of this because they leave you on a cliffhanger so that you can't exhale, so that there is no resolution, the story is not complete, and they bring you back next week. This is why I cheat on Kate all the time with Netflix. And we start a show together, and I can't handle it. I can't handle the cliffhanger. I keep watching without her there. I'm a terrible person, I know. But it's this very real thing that a story without that resolution is very incomplete. It would also be like a puzzle with every single piece except for one piece. I hate puzzles, but some people like puzzles. If that one piece is missing, the whole puzzle is an eyesore. It gets under your skin. You need that one piece to feel relieved about the puzzle. This is the sense of the creation narrative with Sabbath. I could read through the whole narrative, but I really wanted to focus on one verse because for 6 days, however you want to frame that, God has been creating everything that is, the most incredible drama we could ever envision, to see out of nothing everything in the universe that exists. God is creating stars and planets and land and water on earth and animals and ultimately humanity. It's this incredible story. If you were wrapped up in that story, you'd probably want to know where it's going. How is this story going to end? This creation narrative going to end? Genesis 2:3 is God taking that exhale, taking that breath, concluding that Netflix episode. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all his work that he had done in creation. I find that language in this verse very interesting. He blessed the seventh day and made it holy because on it he rested. Something inherent about rest is holy. Because he rested, he called it holy. There was something about the fact that this was the day that God effectively did nothing. He sat there, he observed all the good work that he had done, and said, I'm going to take a day. This time of stopping and observing is holy. This rest is holy. You think about all of creation. There is this rhythm to night and day and all of the creatures, and even intended to be for us, of when we're asleep and when we're awake and when animals hibernate and when they come out in the different seasons. All of creation has this natural rhythm to it. God says there's something very holy about that rest piece of the rhythm. There's something holy about that time where we stop. Also, I think we look to the creation narrative and we think of, well, God created a bunch of stuff and people and animals, and that's true. He also created time. The 6 days, it talks about all the stuff that he created. We might not know what to do with the seventh day because we're thinking, well, he didn't create anything. Well, he kind of did. He said there is a whole day in time that I'm saying is holy. There's a part of time that I'm creating that should be rest and stoppage that is holy. We don't want to overly focus on all the stuff that God creates and miss that even within the creation, within time, he creates space for stoppage. Something is inherently holy about rest. What is God doing here? I think there's a lot to unpack because this is a very interesting, and maybe to some of us a new concept. God, we would think, would just create the world, create everything, and move on. But he takes an entire day to say something about rest and stoppage is holy. I want to talk today about what is this going on? What is so important about Sabbath? Why would we need Sabbath? What happens when we don't have it? How do we address it? Then how do we practice it if we believe it is important? Why do we need it? Why did God do it? How do we address it? Well, first of all, why do we need Sabbath? What is so holy and important about rest? God made it at the foundation of creation. I want to talk about this in two ways. First, just practically, and then more spiritually. Well, practically speaking, we don't really even know what work is without rest. In some way, a lot of the things that we understand, you understand based on their opposites. We don't have a concept of resting if we don't have a concept of working. We need some kind of sense of when the work stops, or our whole life would be work and we'd have no sense of what we're even doing with our time. Everything would get lost in non-stop work. Our whole life would be work. We wouldn't even know what it is. There's a practical component to, you know that the job is done because you have that moment of exhale and that moment of rest. You have the 9 to 5, or you have the long weekend, or you have the big project, but at least at some point, there's a conclusion to it. We need rest to practically just understand our work. Now, more profoundly, I think, particularly in our culture, we need a calendar to make sense of our work. We don't think about this a lot, and again, I think of the creation narrative and how we want to focus on all the stuff that God created, but there's something significant about the fact that he created basically a rhythm of time. The 7 days didn't have to be 7 days. It could have been 3 months. God could not have created a day of break. We don't think about the fact that we have a 7-day week. We could have had a 15-day week. We could have had a nonstop every single day you work and there's no break ever. We have this idea that every 7 days there's this bracket of time. We have our calendars that are broken up into the months, the calendar that we've inherited. We have our alarm clocks that tell us what we do when we do it. That by having a day of rest, you're saying there is some type of rhythm to your entire life. There's some kind of timing to your whole life. If you didn't have some kind of calendar, if you didn't have some kind of rhythm, then the work and everything would never stop. The thing is, in our culture, we get this. For one, we've inherited it. We know that we have a calendar. We know that we have January through December. We know that we have these holidays. We know that we have a work week. And tomorrow we celebrate Labor Day. Culture addresses this idea that we have some kind of rhythm to our time, and that's great, and it can have good outcomes. I think Labor Day is a good outcome. In 1887, they said, we want to honor the fact that people work a lot. Let's have a national holiday. And by the time, about 8 years later, 1894, it became a national holiday. We have Labor Day to celebrate the fact that people work. That's a part of our calendar. We see it every single year. Labor Day is there. We have all these other things on our calendar like July 4th. We have things like our Christmas holiday. We have things like Thanksgiving here in America that dictate the way that we spend our time. It can be easy, though, to just get used to how our calendar is handed to us. And we don't think about the fact that our calendar dictates what we do. We don't think about the fact that my alarm clock tells me how to spend my time and could tell me to never stop working, could tell me to never take a break. My calendar could say, there is no time. Well, who's telling you that? Well, your calendar. Who's telling you that? The culture you're at, the job that you're at, the place that you're at. We have these calendars, we have our alarm clocks that kind of become the driving force of our life. And practically, if you don't have something in your calendar that is in some way termed rest or break or sleep, you could fill your calendar up as much as you wanted to. There's a very practical piece to There was a seventh day and it was holy. There's a rhythm to time. We have a work week. We have months. We have holidays. Because without it, you could fill your calendar however much you wanted and never stop. I have a very mixed relationship with my alarm clock. I hate my alarm clock. Every morning, I'm not very happy to hear my alarm clock, but I do what it tells me to do. Sometimes I don't listen, but then I get in trouble by school or my boss, which I guess would be God or New Life or the elders or something. If I just didn't show up one Sunday for church. I'm usually up before church, but we have these things in our lives that kind of tell us what to do with our time. And so much of Sabbath rest is there a piece of your calendar that tells you, now you need to rest. Today, you need to stop. Today, work stops at this hour or for this week. Without some kind of dictation of your time, it could get consumed with all kinds of other things. There's a practical importance to just having rest somewhere in your calendar. Now, spiritually, there's, I think, a lot more meat to get out of this. This is the part where I think I preach a little bit more of the theology behind this. In the Old Testament, the idea of Sabbath, that God said, keep the seventh day holy, was a very real practice of ultimately trusting God. When you see them in the desert and he says on the sixth day, collect, you'll get twice as much, so that the seventh day you'll have plenty, and then it'll start over again on the first day of the following week. They had to trust that there was enough food on the sixth day, that they'd have food on the seventh, and of course, as I'm sure a lot of us would do, they usually tried to save some of the extra food for that seventh day, or tried to gather food on the seventh day, and it rotted, and God was angry about that because they didn't trust him. So much of the practice in the Old Testament was, will you set aside a day for me, believing that I'm the one in control, believing that I'm the one who provides? Think especially about the Sabbath year in the Old Testament. There's an entire year that I'm saying, you need to trust me, that I'm going to give you, he says, 3 times as much in the 6th year, so that year you'll have plenty. You get to the end of year 5. It's just been 1 year at a time. Now in the 6th year, you're getting into the middle of the year and you're thinking, I really hope that God gives us more food than we usually have, because he's saying for the next year, we're not supposed to do any work. We're not supposed to gather anything from the field. We're supposed to just trust this next year he's going to provide. That's hard. In so many ways, that was the point of Sabbath, was, do you trust God with your work? Do you trust God to provide? That you do your part, but you believe ultimately God is your provider. And ultimately that he wants you to rest. And part of rest is not just when you find the time, but when he asks you to make the time. He asks you to say, you need to trust me with your finances. You need to trust me with your calendar. You need to trust me with that relational stress. You need to trust me with that emotional stress. You need to put that on hold. Believe that I'm God and that I've got this. And take some time to rest and be with me. Believe that I'm going to provide. Believe that I'm going to give you a sense of how to deal with that relationship as you stop rather than stressing out about it. You're going to be able to deal with that decision you're making as you stop and don't stress out about it. So much of the Old Testament practice of Sabbath was a huge stretch of trust that God's going to fill in the gap of rest even after all of the work that you thought you needed to do in that time of rest. God's going to fill it in for you. It also, in our practice today, I do think it forces us to think about, if I'm going to say, I need to take a day off from work, or can't take a day off from raising your kids, but maybe you trade with your spouse for a few hours. If I can't do that, if it's literally not possible for me to say to my boss or have a conversation with my family to give me some time to take some kind of break, how much have I allowed those things to dictate my time more than taking the time to trust God? I know it's a delicate discussion, but there is an importance, again, to the sense of our calendar, the sense of our alarm clock, the sense of our lives. It is so easy, especially today with email and the internet. We don't operate based on the daily rhythms. We don't operate when the sun comes up and the sun goes down. We can never stop if we want to. If we get to a point where we realize, I just want a day this week, or one day a week, or some amount of hours every day, or 1 hour in the morning, to stop and give the stuff going on and be with God, and that is not possible, it's worth sitting to say, how much am I trusting God with my time? And how much am I toiling and laboring and trying to fill and fix all of my time myself? I know this is hard for us to wrestle with, but we might think we're so far removed from the Israelite situation, but try to put yourselves in their shoes. When you are saying, for the next year, I'm trusting God to provide everything because God said so, or even just every week, for the next day, I'm trusting God for my food because God said so. There's an important piece to God. If rest is holy, there's something holy and important about rest. Will I trust you and make space for that? I'm going to dig into a little bit more. I think there's reason to, and not just because God said in the Old Testament, but there also is a bit of, when we read the Old Testament, that's the Old Testament, there is something important to recognize of discipline, that sometimes the rubber meets the road of, I just don't want to do this because I've filled everything else in, and God may be pushing against that. There are some practical things, though, I'm going to dive into a little bit more. An illustration I would say of this that's very poignant to me on the discipline aspect, there is a Jewish restaurant or food shop, I can't remember, in New York, that they always practice their Shabbat, their Sabbath, right, Friday evening to Saturday evening. Well, Friday is Black Friday. It's like the day for a company of any sort, and they could have had sales on their food and everything else, and they were closed on Black Friday. And someone asked, what in the world are you doing? That's the number one day to make money. And their response was, we report to a higher authority. Our sense of allegiance is not to the market. Our sense of allegiance is not to how much money we gain as a company. Our sense of allegiance is to Yahweh, is to God. I recognize that's a more rigid Old Testament practice, but I think there's something to learn from them in that. To have that kind of reverence for rest is worth consideration. And in the New Testament, things I think begin to hit home a little bit more for us. For one, the whole point through Christ is that we are delivered from the curse, we're delivered from the fall, and part of the fall was the toilsome labor of our work. It says part of the curse to Adam is that you will now work by the sweat of your brow, and work becomes this burdensome thing, and life can be consumed with this hard, burdensome work. But that through Christ, the idea is that we can overcome that. And the author of Hebrews addresses this idea, where they unpack, for one, the author goes through this whole thing of talking about the Sabbath rest in the Old Testament, but then transitioning and adapting it to our New Testament practice today. So in Hebrews 4, verse 1, the author says, "Therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. For we also have had the good news proclaimed to us, just as they did, the Israelites. But the message they heard was of no value to them because they did not share the faith of those who obeyed. Now we who have believed enter that rest." The wider picture the author is painting is the Israelites did not fully enter into the Sabbath rest that God asked for them, that God called for them. They disobeyed. But now through Christ, we have the ability to fully enter into the rest that God intended. The whole point of Sabbath, the whole point of practice in the Old Testament, the whole point of law was this stand-in of this is this practice that there is value to, but it is inadequate. it doesn't fully reach what it's intended for. And now through Christ, we can fully reach what it was intended for. Taking a day off, trusting God, taking the year off in the Old Testament, that definitely facilitated that sense of trust, that sense of belief in God to provide, etc. But it was still just a limited practice. It wasn't the full rest that God wanted for his people, and that's what is obtained through Christ. There is this more profound sense of rest, this infinite sense of rest and access to God, to Christ, a different level of trust, a different level of peace, a different level of fulfillment that we can now, it says as believers, can enter into that rest. Part of what I think this looks like, I said I want to dive into I'm going to hold off on that for a second. Part of what I think this looks like is, as I said earlier, if you don't have the resolution to the story, it drives you nuts. The story doesn't make sense. You don't have the last puzzle piece. It doesn't make sense. Spiritually speaking, through the New Testament, through Christ, the broader picture here is all of your work, all of our toil, all of our labor, it doesn't make sense without Christ. Because Christ is the one who gives all the significance and the meaning and the purpose to your work. Without that Sabbath rest, without that abiding in Christ, without that full sense of satisfaction in him, your job, the way you spend your time, the way you raise your family, the way you deal with your family, the way you make money, all of that doesn't have the true meaning that it's meant for. This ultimately becomes an existential question. It's a question of meaning. So much of why rest was holy, I said this is holy time that makes sense of time. We lose perspective on why we're working, why we're making money, why we're raising our family the way we're raising our family, why we're dealing with conflict in New Life, why we address racism the way we address it, why we address division the way we address it. We lose perspective on what we're doing and why when we don't take the time to stop and be with Christ. We have to stop and be with the Lord. We have to have that holy time to observe his holiness in the world and through the world and all that he's doing, to live holy lives, to be holy people. There's this genuine importance spiritually to part of stopping to be with Christ is you recognize all that God is doing independently of you. It sets your ego aside. And when you stop and just observe what Jesus is doing and observe what God is doing, you get a greater sense of how you fit into his plan and not how you are running your own plan. If we never stop to be with Christ, to enter into that infinite rest, we toil, we labor, going back to the fall. This is the tension that we're trying to resolve. The burden of the fall is this toil and this labor and this curse. The victory of Christ is that we come through that, we overcome that, we have ultimate purpose, we have eternal resurrection, we have eternal hope, and that will undo this sense of toil and the sense of labor, the sense of futility, the sense of burden. Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are heavy and weary laden, I will give you rest." I'll give you a true sense of your purpose. I'll give you a true sense of all the toil that you're carrying. I'll give you a true sense of everything you're wrestling with. The Sabbath was a placeholder. Yes, you need to make the time, and that's great. But now we can make the time, and Jesus is readily available to make it clear to you why you're laboring, why you're working, whatever you're struggling with, however you're spending your time. That is invaluable rest. Because when you come back to center like that, Jesus says, "Apart from me, you can do nothing. I am the vine and you are the branches." When you come back to that center of Jesus at the heart of how you spend your time and what you do, it reinvigorates all your work. It gives you a greater sense of satisfaction and fulfillment as a teacher or a business person or a stay-at-home mom or a stay-at-home dad or a family member resolving conflict, however you're spending your time. he gives you that sense of eternal significance and purpose to how you're spending your time. I said earlier that I wanted to touch on some more practical things. That this isn't just that God says so, and in so many ways, that's kind of the struggle with the Old Testament. There were these rules, and may not have fully understood why, but we were obedient. Well, through Christ now, it's not just a God said so. It's because there is this tremendous benefit to Sabbath rest, that it reinvigorates your work. It gives your work and the way you spend your time greater purpose and fulfillment. I also would say, though, there are some very practical things that come out of this, that this is not just sort of happenstance, that this truth that I'm proclaiming to you is not removed from reality. In science and in human study, there is evidence of how significant and how important rest is to make your work better, to make your time more satisfactory and less draining. I said, why do we need Sabbath? I've kind of told you that. Ultimately, I believe that infinite rest will invigorate your purpose. So how do we practice that? One thing I would say is just recognize that you are wired for rest. There is a study that was done that basically our bodies operate on somewhat of these 7-day rhythms. Call it circadian rhythms, that if you don't take roughly a day, 24 hours, it could be spread out over the week, but some kind of piece of rest in your time, your effectivity, your efficiency begins to break down. Your body begins to break down. We're not made to just work like a machine nonstop. Biochemically, it doesn't work. If you don't take time to stop, your work will deteriorate if you don't take time to rest. And in this article also talked about, it wasn't a religious article, but it was saying religion has something to teach us about being efficient. And it mentioned that when you stop, it said to practice stopping and letting the world come to you rather than you trying to come to the world. When we're working, we're always wrestling and figuring out how we can bring what we've got to bring to the world. So much of Sabbath is stopping and saying, what all is God bringing to me? What is God doing? How is God working around me? Let me listen and pay attention. And I would say that from a spiritual angle, but just from this very practical angle, it said that biochemically, when you do that, when you stop and just kind of let the world be, the natural creative synapses in your brain begin to fire. Pastor Sam actually talked about Sabbath several months ago, and he played this video of this orchestra that happened in a public square, and he used that as an illustration of that is what Sabbath rest can ultimately look like when adequate space is given for the creative. When you rest, that true creativity can come forward. Practically, that means stopping. What does that look like? It might mean that there is an hour in your calendar. It might mean that there's a day a week. It might mean that there is time to talk with a spiritual brother or sister to work through some stuff you're working through and then pray about it after. There's lots of different ways, but somehow is there space for you to stop and just let the world come to you. Stop toiling with the world. Stop toiling with your responsibilities. Stop toiling with what you're trying to carry and see what God's already doing. See how God might already be trying to inspire you. God might already have the answer, but you've been working toward it so much on your end, you haven't made the space for him to show you what he's doing on his end. There's a very practical reality to that, but there's also a spiritual reality that God might have a lot to show you about your job and your work and your time, but you're going to have to take some time to stop to see it, whatever that is. The other practical thing I would say is sleep. It's interesting, we will spend roughly a third of our lives doing nothing. Maybe a fourth, depending on your stage in life. But God made us to sleep. You think about it, God could have made us to not need sleep. He could have made us to just be awake all the time, but he didn't. There's something significant about the fact that even within our very created DNA is this need to sleep. There are roughly 6,500 deaths a year from drowsy drivers and about 10,000 a year from drunk drivers. Drowsy driving, and it's also harder to diagnose, is almost, if not equally as dangerous as drunk driving. It's a real problem in our culture that we are so driven by work and responsibility that we don't get enough sleep. If you don't get enough sleep, it's going to be harder. You might be sitting there trying to hear what God has to say, and next thing you know, you're snoring. I would say, number one, that's okay. It probably just means you need to sleep more. So do that. And number two, maybe you can come back later and you're able to stop and you actually are rested enough to hear what God has to say. One practical thing for this I've said to people is maybe the most quality time you can spend with God, next time you take a nap, if you can take a nap, pray right when you get up. Pray right when you feel rested. There might be more clarity to see what God is doing and see what God is trying to reveal to you. I understand sleep has its limitations. I understand that we're busy. But no matter how busy we are, you're made to sleep. Whatever that hour mark is for you or that nap mark is for you, I don't know. But recognize that you can't escape the fact that you need sleep. So be mindful of how you might need to make space to sleep more, to hear what God is doing. And the last thing I'll say, and I'll close, is also think about how you spend your vacation. Try to be mindful of our vacation should not just be this mindset of work hard, play hard. That's kind of a cultural philosophy, not necessarily a biblical philosophy. Whatever it looks like for you is fine. If you need to be super active on your vacation, that's fine. But just think of your vacation not just physically away from work, but spiritually renewing as well. Whatever that looks like, however you take time away, time with your family, time to not work, I would just encourage you to also think of it spiritually and not just physically. What does it look like in my vacation to make space for God to renew me? Time in your vacation, time to sleep, and generally just time to stop with your calendar, with your alarm clock, however you construct that, time to stop and see what God is doing in your life and not all that you're trying to do for yourself, for your life. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you that you are doing literally infinitely more than we could do for ourselves. Right now, every person in this room, we all have so many things that we could worry about. We have job responsibilities, we have family responsibilities, we have church responsibilities. But God, you are God and we are not. Help us in whatever way that we need to make space in our lives to acknowledge that truth. Different hours in the day or different days of the week, to stop and acknowledge what you're doing and receive what you're doing, to renew us, to reinvigorate us, to let your resurrection life give purpose and meaning to our work. Renew us so that our work is full with you and not drained by our endless effort. Thank you that you invite us into your infinite Sabbath rest through Christ. Give us the courage and the discipline to receive your grace for that invitation.